Greetings, Cornerstone family. It's very good to be back with you again on this Wednesday, May the 27th. We are just a week and a half away from gathering again as a church for the first time in mass since this coronavirus situation has come upon us. And so let me just remind you to please go to the church's website, and on the main page you will see a link to a survey that we would love for you to fill out. Just to give us as leaders the most information that we can possibly have as we prepare for these two services on June the 7th. The 9 a.m. service, the 11 a.m. service are both pretty much equally split right now, almost identical numbers. And we like that. That's good. That allows us to stay as spread out as we possibly can. We just don't want to get blindsided by things that we weren't expecting. So the more of you who can fill out that survey for us, the better. And we will continue to update you with more information. Keep an eye on the website and be looking for a new post in the next day or so with a little bit of an update about where we are. But we're going to get you information as we kind of make decisions, and obviously we're going to continue to watch things as they unfold. And so we'll keep you as informed as we can. Let me give you just a couple other things right off the bat here by way of reopening. Tomorrow we will begin meeting again with our men's Bible study. It meets Thursday morning. We're going to meet tomorrow morning at 7:30 here in the church. We're going to meet in the fellowship hall where we can stay a little more spread out. We're going to provide the coffee. We're asking you to bring your own breakfast. I think many of our men know about this already, the ones who have been attending. But if you've not been attending that and you would like to come check it out. And then also on Wednesday night, June the 10th, we plan to resume youth meeting and Wednesday night prayer meeting. That'll be the Wednesday after our first Sunday back together. And we'll keep giving you details about those things as we plan them and get them ready. But those Wednesday night services will resume on June the 10th. And so we're real excited about getting back together with you as a church family. Small groups as well. We'll begin resuming those soon, and so we'll keep you posted on those things as they happen. Today I want to continue with our study on the problem of evil and suffering and approaching that from a biblical perspective. And remember, we're trying to build a foundation here, put pieces in the puzzle so we have a better picture. We're not getting every question we would ever want answered. There's a great deal of mystery, as we're going to see in our study today. There's still a great deal of mystery in suffering and evil that the Bible holds out for us. But we're getting a firm foundation under our feet, I think. And, over my years of just being in churches and dealing with people in ministry, the people who handle suffering and heartache the best in their lives are those who have a good foundation under their feet when it comes. They have studied these things, and they kind of have a good, solid understanding of who God is and God's sovereignty. And so when suffering comes, they're not swept away, as it were, by that heartache. And so I hope that you'll take this opportunity, if things are going pretty well in your life, to study these matters, because for all of us, the day is coming when heartache is going to be there, and we need to be prepared for it. So today I want to look at what I would just call the Bible's personal study of evil and suffering, and that is the book of Job. There's other aspects of suffering that we see in Scripture that are intensely personal. Paul gives us some insight into his suffering, and certainly we have a lot of insight into the suffering of Jesus. But Job seems to be that place where we go when we try to address this question, because this book seems poised to answer this question and to deal with this question for us. And so what I want to do is take today and maybe the next one at least, and maybe the next 2 weeks to deal with this. And then we're going to move toward a closeout of this study as we address a few more things. But I want us to take a look at the book of Job. There's a lot here. Many of you are familiar with it. If you're not, take this opportunity to read it. It's a book that you can read fairly quickly. But there's a lot here, and so there's a lot to think about, a lot to examine. We're going to try and pull out highlights from the book and principles that we can apply and illustrate just how things are being handled in the book, and especially God's response to Job later on in the book and so forth. So today we'll kind of get an introduction and get sort of off and running in terms of studying the book of Job. And so let's begin thinking about these first 3 chapters, the background of the story of Job. This is perhaps the oldest book we have in Scripture. There are many who think that Job was the first book written. It's a pretty ancient book any way you look at it. And yet we have a pretty sophisticated understanding of who God is and his ways here in the book. And we're given some background. This is a story that's kind of a narrative story. We're being told the story of Job and his sufferings. And so it comes to us in a way that's really personal and not just theological principles and so forth. And so it hits a little harder for us because we can sort of put ourselves in Job's shoes a little bit. And so we're given a picture in chapters 1, 2, and 3 of this man, Job. And the first thing we're told about him is he's incredibly wealthy. In chapter 1, verse 3, we read about the wealth that he has. And of course, in that day, wealth was measured in terms of livestock. The number of children you had was also a pretty good indicator. And so he's got these 10 children, 7 sons, 3 daughters. He's got thousands upon thousands of different types of livestock there. And so in just a verse or two, we're given this picture of an incredibly wealthy man and basically told that he was the greatest man in that part of the world in his day. We're also told in verse 8 that Job is a truly righteous man. Now, I know from our perspective as New Testament believers with the book of Romans under our belt and so forth, none of us would probably ever presume to think of ourselves as truly righteous people. And all of us know that deep down, there is no one good, not even one, right? Those are the things that we kind of come away with as we study the New Testament. And of course, that's true and taught in the Old Testament as well. But it is also true that we can speak of a person being righteous in a relative sense, right? I mean, God recognizes people who act wickedly and people who act righteously. And we read about those things in Scripture, right? And we're commended for doing good things, and we're chastised and so forth for doing bad things. And so when the Scripture speaks of Job as a truly righteous man, let's not be too quick to jump on that and think, well, we know he's not really righteous. I don't think we can say that walking away from the book of Job. It is God himself in chapter 1, verse 8, who says to Satan, "Have you considered Job?" God himself is the one who holds out Job as a model of righteousness. And I don't think we can gainsay that. I don't think that's something we can just minimize. I think one of the things we have to affirm throughout the book of Job, that Job is truly a righteous person. Now, that doesn't mean he's flawless. Doesn't mean he doesn't make some mistakes, and he will. But we need to understand this. And one of the things that tells us right off the bat is that there really is such a thing as innocent suffering. We know this from the New Testament, right? Jesus is asked by the disciples about this man who was born blind. Well, who sinned, him or his parents? And the response is neither he nor his parents sinned to cause this blindness, right? There is sin that comes, there is suffering that comes in our lives that isn't the result of chastisement for a particular sin. And that's something we see in the book of Job right away. The book is setting us up to see Job as someone who truly is innocent. And so his suffering throughout the book is not something that he's brought upon himself through wickedness or some sense in which he's being chastised by God for his sinfulness. So again, as careful as we might want to be to qualify Job's righteousness, let's not qualify it away. He really is being presented here as a righteous man. And this righteous man in chapters 1 and 2 is given over to Satan. He's given over to Satan in a couple of ways. First of all, in chapter 1, verse 12, God allows Satan to basically come at Job in any way except a personal attack. And so right away in chapter 1, we see Job's children killed. We see all of his wealth removed from him through several different episodes. And by the end of chapter 1, Job is destitute, and the only thing that's left to him is his wife. And then we come to chapter 2, where Satan is given further permission to touch Job personally and physically, but not to take his life. And so by the end of chapter 2, Job has not only lost everything, but now Job is physically suffering as well. He has these boils on his skin and so forth, and he's physically suffering, as well as the mental anguish of losing his children and all of his worldly possessions. And again, the only thing left to him is his wife. who seems to, and now remember and think about this, his wife had suffered probably as much as he has, and yet she chastises him from a point of sounds like unbelief. Why don't you just curse God and die? And Job's not willing to go that route. Job does not sin or curse God with his lips. In fact, he bows down and worships after all of these things happen to him. So we see that this affirmation of Job as a good person is really confirmed to us by the way that Job initially responds to all this. So as we get to chapter 3, we see Job beginning to respond to these things. And he begins to curse the day of his birth. In fact, this entire 3rd chapter is just a lament, a curse of his own birth and his own existence. And here he sounds a lot like Jeremiah. If you go to Jeremiah chapter 20, verses 14 through 18, you'll see some real parallels with what's happening in Job here, where both Jeremiah and Job curse their own birth, the day of their birth, and Jeremiah goes very far and calls down curses upon the man who announced that his mother was expecting and with child. So this is obviously a very hyperbolic language, just a real overstatement of the case to make the point. And so Job goes through this great anguish we see in chapter 3. So any of us who have any feeling in us at all have to feel for this man. By the time we get to the end of chapter 3, we've seen a really good man, a really wealthy man, just destroyed in almost every conceivable way, except that he still has his life. So enter in this second section of the book, which is the longest section of the book, in chapters 4 through 31, enter these 3 friends of Job's, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And throughout these chapters, we get this back and forth between Job and his 3 friends. And, what we see right away is the friends, as soon as they arrive, they do what I would say would be the absolute right thing, and that is they don't say anything. They see the pitiable state that Job is in, and all they do is sit down and suffer with him. They tear their garments, they throw ash on their head, and they just sit in silence for 7 days because they all noted just how devastated he was. But at the end of that time, they begin to engage with Job. And what we see is that Job and his friends really have a similar theology here. They have a very simplistic theology of suffering and retribution. So let's talk about that for a minute. Their understanding is that if you do bad things, God's going to chastise you. And if you do good things, God is going to bless you. Now again, like a proverb, this is not really a nuanced view. It's presented in terms of black and white. And that's how it's presented to us. That's the nature of a proverb. That's the way it teaches and gets across the truth that it's trying to convey. And here in Job, we see these 3 friends having this view, the simplistic view, that suffering comes about because of sin. And it happens in a way that is almost mechanical, almost mathematical. Just like 2 and 2 equals 4, Job, if you sin, God's going to chastise you. And Job sort of shares this view. And really the only place that Job differs from his friends is that Job believes he's innocent, while his friends say, no, you must have sinned. You must have done something to cause God to do these things to you. Okay? So both Job and his friends have this view that God punishes evildoers and rewards the righteous. We see this in Job 4, 7 through 9. Remember now whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble harvest it. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they come to an end. Now, this is the first friend speaking to Job, Eliphaz, and this is really the heart of the 3 friends' position. You're going to see it reiterated over and over as you go throughout these chapters. They will say all sorts of things, but they always come back to this. People get what they deserve from God, and not just at the end when everything's finished, like we've been talking about for a couple of weeks. People get what they deserve from God now, and they get it in almost a mechanical way. You sin, God's going to punish you, and you're going to see it very, very quickly. So that's the first thing we're going to note from these chapters. And you'll see that if you read through it. And Job doesn't necessarily disagree with that. he just continues to pronounce his own innocence, whereas they didn't buy the innocence. They felt like Job had to have sinned. That brings us to a second thing we get here, and that is this unquestioning view of God's sovereignty. Both Job and his friends assume and operate from the view that all suffering falls under the umbrella of God's sovereignty. There is never a hint that somehow God doesn't have anything to do with this. God is a passive observer. He's just watching what happens, and he can't really interfere because he's chosen not to. There's no hint that maybe God isn't really strong enough to bring this about, as though there's a dualism, let's say. You've got a good principle in the universe and an evil principle, and right now the evil principle kind of has the upper hand, and God has to battle back to get the upper hand again. There's none of that. Okay, this is not a dualistic presentation of the cosmos. This is not a God who is limited in his power. This is not a God who has chosen to limit himself from interaction with the cosmos. They believe and know and never question that God is behind this. Now, there's no hint here of secondary causes. They don't necessarily think in terms of Satan's involvement here, and that's information we have from other places in Scripture. But their view of God's sovereignty is unquestioning. They just know and believe and intuitively think that God is behind this in some way. Okay, so that's never questioned here. The third thing we see is that Job and his three friends, they differ in their view of Job's righteousness. Here's where they kind of begin to part ways. The text emphasizes repeatedly and in a detailed way, really, the goodness of Job. And that is never questioned anywhere in this book in terms of his righteousness. Now, again, he's going to make his mistakes, and God's going to chastise him later for those mistakes. But even in that, he's not, the truthfulness of his righteousness is not somehow done away with. This highlights again for us that there is such a thing as innocent suffering. The Bible is not here presenting to us this guy made his own bed, now he's got to lay in it. This is innocent suffering, and Job throughout the book is going to continue to insist on his innocence. So one of the places we see this early on and in a pretty clear way, Job will say in chapter 7, verses 20 and 21, "Have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher to men?" He's addressing God here. "Why have you set me as your target so that I am a burden to myself? Why then do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I will lie down in the dust, and you will seek me, but I will not be." Now, Job here is not claiming some sort of sinless perfection. He speaks about his transgression and his iniquity, but throughout the book he will continue to affirm or continue to argue he hasn't done anything specifically that would merit the suffering that has been brought upon him. That is something that is unquestioned. Job continues to make that case. So even though he recognizes himself as a sinner, he also recognizes that he has lived a righteous life. And this isn't presented in Job as something that's really hypocritical, that Job just doesn't understand really how sinful he is. Keep that in mind. It's really important, I think, to get the gist of the book. So even though Job is fundamentally correct in asserting his innocence before God, he moves on throughout the book to get so zealous to make his case that he does begin to cross some lines. And here's where Job begins to make some mistakes. And later God is going to chastise him for this. But listen to this line from Job in Job chapter 10, verses 1 through 7. He says, "I loathe my very life. Therefore I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out in the bitterness of my soul." It almost sounds like he's saying here, I'm going to just say what's on my mind, and if God chooses to take my life, then so be it, because I've become to loathe and hate my own life. And so he goes on to say, "I say to God, do not declare me guilty, but tell me what charges you have against me. Does it please you to oppress me, to spurn the works of your hands, while you smile on the plans of the wicked? Do you have eyes of flesh? Do you see as a mortal sees? Are your days like those of a mortal, or your years like those of a strong man, that you must search out my faults and probe after my sin, though you know that I am not guilty and that no one can rescue me from your hand? Now, there's a lot being said right here, but clearly Job is beginning to give vent to his frustration. Look, there's a saying when you deal with people who are dealing with substance abuse or people in various situations like that, and that is that hurting people hurt people. And that's really true. People, when we hurt, we tend to lash out at others. You know, when your dog is hurt and you try to help him, he may turn and growl at you because you're hurting him, even though you're trying to help him. I had that happen once. And so, you know, Job is venting his frustrations here, and he's going to do what I'm going to call wrestling with God. And I think there's a place for this, but we need to be careful in how we do that. Job's faith here is such that he can wrestle with God about his suffering. He's not perfect in it, and we need to learn from his mistakes. But you know, it's interesting that Job's three friends say an awful lot of things about God that we would read in a vacuum and say, that's good, there's truth here. And Job says some things like this that seem very disrespectful to God. But Job is doing this from a place of faith. He's doing this from a place of belief. And yet at the end, God says of Job that he's spoken rightly of me and you haven't. Even though God will chastise Job for some of the things he says. Again, you remember in Job 38, 1 and 2, the Lord comes to Job when he begins to speak to him and says, who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? And then in chapter 40, verses 1 through 8, God begins to speak to Job again and basically says, are you going to correct me? And Job tries to start responding. I'm unworthy. How can I reply to you? And God essentially cuts him off and says, no, brace yourself. I'm going to give you some more questions. And then he goes on for a couple more chapters questioning Job. So there's no question that God rebukes Job for some of this. But the simple truth is that Job understands his innocence in this. He's not done anything to merit this kind of treatment, he believes. And his friends keep asserting that, no, you must have sinned in some way to bring this on yourself. And we'll see more of that as we move on through. Let me point out a couple other things and we'll wrap it up for today because our time's about up. Notice the absolute lack of compassion from Job's friends. I guess I struggle with this one a little bit because I do think they did the right thing when they came and sat with him for 7 days straight. Didn't say a word to him. They just sat and suffered with him. And I think that's something that we need to learn from. That's sometimes the right thing to do. Sometimes it's the only right thing to do. People aren't always looking for a direct answer about why something has happened. They just want to know that somebody cares and somebody's there with them. And so I think that was a good thing. And I even think there's space later on for working to correct someone. If their theology is such, they're beginning to question things about God that they shouldn't question. So I do think we need to give them credit for that. But they begin to lecture Job theologically later in ways that really aren't compassionate at all. Bildad the Shuhite answers in Job 8, 1 through 6, how long will you say these things? This is after Job had asserted his innocence. How long will you say these things and the words of your mouth be a mighty wind? Does God pervert justice? Or does the Almighty pervert what is right? If your sons sinned against him, then he delivered them into the power of their transgression. If you would seek God and implore the compassion of the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, surely now he would rouse himself for you and restore your righteous estate. Think about what's being said there. What Bildad essentially is saying to Job is that, look, your sons are dead because they did something and God judged them for it. And you're just basically being too stubborn to admit that. If God were on your side, he would rise up and restore you to your righteous estate. But clearly you've done something. Clearly your sons did something. You're in sin in some way that you don't see and understand. And all this eventually gets to be way too much for Job. And I think in what's sort of an offhanded, humorous line in the book of Job, in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, Job responds, truly then you are the people, and with you wisdom will die. I like the the NIV translation of this, surely you are the ones, and all wisdom will die with you. Oh, that I had your kind of wisdom, Job is saying. So there is a real lack of compassion ultimately with these friends. I mean, it's one thing to try to help someone understand maybe what the scripture says about God and his ways when they're in the midst of hurting and suffering. But when you begin to say to someone, the reason this is happening is because you have sinned, or because your sons have sinned, and that's what God has judged you. Or as many would say in our day, you just don't have enough faith right now for God to do these good things for you. That is incredibly uncompassionate, hard, and cruel for us to suggest those things. The Bible gives us no right to say those kinds of things. And I think in the end, what Job's friends really did that made God angry was that they presumed to speak for God when they ultimately did not know why God was doing what he was doing, but they still presumed to speak for God. It's one thing to say, look, the scripture says this about God. It's another thing to start presuming you know what God is up to in any given circumstance. Katrina hits New Orleans, and all of a sudden televangelists are telling us that, well, that happened in New Orleans because of their sinfulness. There's gambling down there and so forth. That's a really scary place to put ourselves in. And then one last thing here, and just kind of this initial looking at the book. Job and his friends, as they go back and forth, Job's friends eventually give up trying to convince Job. And this fourth friend that we haven't met yet, Elihu, comes into the picture in chapters 32 through 37, and he takes a very different approach. At the end of this book, Elihu is neither condemned nor acquitted in terms of what he said about God. God doesn't really respond to what he says here, but he does handle it very differently from the other three friends. And I think there's some good things he says here, and then some things we might want to critique. In Job 32, 1 through 3, we kind of get him coming on the scene. He says, then these three men ceased answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. In other words, here's a guy that doesn't want to hear the truth. He doesn't want any correction, so we're going to be done with him. And but the anger of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, of the family of Ram, burned against Job. Against Job, his anger burned because he justified himself before God. Here's a guy who just continues to profess his own righteousness before God. And later he's going to really come at Job for questioning God's justice. And I think he was really right in doing that. But also his anger burns against Job's three friends because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. They never were able to pin anything on Job. They just condemned him. And so, well, you must have done something. And so he's angry at them as well. And so chapters 32 through 37, he's gonna have some things to say there. Chapter 33, verse 12, he is going to rebuke Job for questioning God's justice. And ultimately, he's going to say that we have to operate from the assumption that God is just in 36:3. He's going to attribute justice to his maker. He's going to attribute righteousness to his maker. And so we start from the fundamental assumption that God is just. He's not capricious. He's not doing this for no reason, some just random kind of suffering he's going to throw around. God is ultimately just. Now, there's a lot we haven't got into yet. I know that. We're just kind of introducing this. So if you haven't studied Job in a while, go back and read it. Read the entire book over the next week so that when we come back next week, we're going to start talking about some of the things that Job said and God's response to Job. And then we'll get into the end of the book. And there's where we'll have several principles we'll be able to kind of pull away and make some application to our understanding of evil and suffering in the world. So I look forward to seeing you Sunday. And I really look forward to being back together a week from Sunday. Again, I hope we'll see many of you men tomorrow morning. And church, we miss you. We love you. Looking forward to getting back together. And we'll see you soon. God bless.